Okay, and here we are back again from our intermission, and we're going to begin to talk about the actual material of the course now, having spent the first part of our discussion this evening talking about the format of the course and the assignments and so on. One other thing, however, before we go on, that did occur to me in discussions with a couple of the students about assignments in the intermission. Internet sources. Nowadays, it's real easy, isn't it? You use Google or whatever search engine you want to use, and you start looking up information on, God knows, pretty much everything, right? Well, there are internet sources and internet sources. Be very, very, very careful about what kinds of internet materials you are using. Handle them with care and handle them very critically. I love to tell this story. I was teaching the graduate seminar in Beowulf a couple of years ago. This is one in which graduate students were actually reading Beowulf in the original. And so at one point we got talking about internet sources, and one of the graduate students informed me that he had run into a whole site on Beowulf. Come to find out, it is hosted by a 9-year-old boy who has this site for posting his ideas about Beowulf and materials that he has collected about Beowulf. And let's give him all the credit in the world for his initiative. I mean, how many 9-year-old boys are going to do something like that? On the other hand, is that a credible source for somebody to use in an academic paper? Surely not. So one has to be very, very careful about the kinds of materials that one is using, that one finds on the internet. Usually the most reliable materials are in scholarly books and encyclopedias and articles in journals and so forth. That is not to say that there aren't wonderful, wonderful materials on the internet. Just be careful. And also be careful of the tendency that some people have just to want to copy and paste. I mean, my God, it's just the easiest thing in the world. Download something, copy, paste, and so forth. No, 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 no. That's plagiarism. So be very, very, very careful about that sort of thing too. So, having said all of that, I know that individuals may have individual questions for me, either among the group that's here with me or those of you who are taking the course at a distance. So if you do have specific individual questions, please bring them up with me or with the assistant instructor. Okay, so let's go on and begin to talk about the actual material of the course. And if we can go to the PowerPoint slides, please. Let's talk about, whoa! I have to go to another step here. Okay, there we are. Romanticism. When we're talking about romantic writers and different romanticisms, how do you go about defining something like that, as complex and as varied as it is? Well, here I am following the 20th century, famous 20th century philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said that you can often define things not by saying exactly what it is, but by talking about the features that it shares in common with other members of the same family. So you can't talk about what is the essence of Romanticism, and is Byron more romantic than Wordsworth, or is Wordsworth less romantic than Keats? You see, that sort of thing doesn't make any sense. What we can talk about is a family of writers, speaking metaphorically, of course, because these people were not literally related to one another. A family of writers who can be recognized as a family of writers by sharing in a pool of common features. Sharing in a pool of common features. So that all members have some of these features, and no member has all of the features. Let me give you an example, a very commonplace example. Actually, I should have a photograph to show you. I have 7 brothers, no sisters, sadly enough, but I have 7 brothers. Very unusual to have 8 boys in a family with no girls. And if you were to look at a picture of us, what you would notice is that we all look different in the sense that we're all individuals, but you can sort of tell that we're all members of the same family. Now, 2 of my brothers are really quite dark. And obviously, as you can see with me, I'm very fair. And 5 of my brothers, like me, are also very fair. 2 of my brothers have brown eyes. The others of us have blue eyes. There are some brothers who are taller, some who are shorter, and so forth. And yet, even despite these differences, you can see that there is a common pool of similarities, such that you can recognize that we are a family of brothers. Okay? That's the kind of thing that Wittgenstein was talking about. That if you try to define something by discovering what its essence is, and then saying, well, this is a true romantic, and that person's not really a true, sort of romantic, but not really a true romantic, or more romantic and less romantic, or pure romantic, or this one's purer than that one, that doesn't make any sense at all. And you don't get anywhere with that sort of thing. It's like trying to define the novel. Nobody has ever been able to define what a novel is in and of itself. But what we can say is there is, in effect, a family of literary narratives such that they share in a common pool, as it were, of features, so that every one of the members of that family will have at least some of the features of that pool, but no member of the family of novels will have all of the features. Does that make sense? So that's the sense in which I'm going to be talking about Romanticism and the various Romantic writers. So what are some of the features of Romanticism? There is at least an implied and sometimes quite explicit critique of industrialization and of urbanization of human life and experience. We'll talk more about this in a moment. I want to give you some interesting historical facts in just a moment about how there was a vast shift, population shift in England. This ultimately was going to happen over here, and it happened in all of the Western countries, and now increasingly it's happening all over the world, of people away from the countryside, away from rural life, and increasingly into towns and cities. And there were massive dislocations as a result, because all of a sudden you have people who are displaced from living on farms and who are forced by economic pressures to move into towns and cities, but who have no experience, no education, no skills for city life. We don't need very many people who are tractor mechanics, say, in big cities, right? We don't need very many people who know about growing crops in big cities. Maybe a few, but not a whole lot. So what are people going to do? As they move by the thousands, and in the 18th and early 19th centuries in England, by the literally hundreds of thousands, into big sprawling cities like London. And guess what happens? All of a sudden you have this huge group of urban poor with all of the problems that are attendant upon that. Crime, overcrowding, health difficulties, public health problems because of lack of adequate sanitation and adequate living facilities, crime, prostitution, and so forth. The first Metropolitan Police Force was created, believe it or not, in London in the 1830s. The 1830s? My God. England had been around for a long, long time without any urban police force. How did they do it? Well, they didn't have the kinds of problems that I'm talking about, for one thing. And people could take care of such crimes as were committed on a local level, in a neighborhood level. There would be constables, and there would be people who could bring about an enforcement of the law on a local level. Somebody comes into your shop and steals something, you set up what was known as a hue and cry. That's a legal term in England and English law, the hue and cry. You know, stop thief, you know, and members of the neighborhood would come and surround the person, and then they would take him before the local justice of the peace right then and there, and punishment would be meted out right then and there, by the way, in most cases. That's how justice was handled for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But then all of a sudden, the cities are overwhelmed. You know, and all of the kinds of problems that we associate with modern cities came into existence around the end of the 18th century and the early stages of the 19th century. So, Romanticism, in part at any rate, emerges as a critique of some of the problems of urbanization and of urban blight, and also of the displacement of peoples from traditional communities, small, rural, village communities, into cities. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on. There's an 18th century writer who wrote a very famous poem called The Deserted Village, and it was something that was happening all over England, where villages were being emptied out by people being forced to move for various reasons into the towns and cities. One of the reasons for that was the Enclosure Acts. The Enclosure Acts. Parliament passed a series of acts that were known as Enclosure Acts, which cut off access to public lands, common lands, of ordinary people, and turned those into private lands, which became huge holdings by a few very rich people. So that when you travel around England or places like England nowadays, you will see that there still are some of those great houses with lots of lands and so on and so on and so on. Well, that's the sort of thing that was happening in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what happened to the people who previously had lived on those lands? Some of them were able to stay as more or less tenant farmers, but the majority of them were forced off the land. And one of the things that people had been able to do from the earliest times, all the way back into the early Middle Ages, and maybe even earlier than that, was that people would be assigned plots of land. So that I'd have my plot of land, you'd have your plot of land, you'd have your plot of land, and so forth. And these plots of land in early times were supposed to be sufficient to feed a family. So the plots would vary in size, by the way, depending upon the arability of the land. But in addition to that, there were also lands that were known as commons. And everybody had access to the common land, so that you could grow some additional vegetables there, or you could, graze some cows there, or some sheep there, or something like that. So that you weren't confined to the plot that was designated as yours alone. And many people could not manage subsistence farming without access to those common lands. And when those were enclosed, and as we now say, privatized, people could no longer support themselves and their families. And they were forced by economic conditions to move into the cities. Now, not only does that cause the problems that I mentioned a moment ago, but also notice what is lost. People whose families had lived for centuries in traditional communities were now uprooted, disrupted. What happens to a family when all of a sudden it moves to the big city? I mean, first of all, what is a family? I mean, in those traditional communities, a family was not mom and pop and the kids. You know, the notion of family as mom and pop and the kids is a very recent notion. A very recent notion. The traditional family is really an extended family. Mom, pop, the kids, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, nieces, nephews, and so forth, often all living together as extended families. You know, well, what happens when families are dislocated from their traditional sites and moved into cities? You know, it may be that in order just to make ends meet, you know, the father has to go off one place and work, the mother has to go off to another place and work. Who's going to take care of the kids? You know, all kinds of problems begin to ensue. In these traditional societies that I'm talking about, the kids would grow up along with the parents and the grandparents and the cousins and uncles and what, you know, aunts and nephews and whatnot, all together. Okay? So all kinds of things are happening. Now that doesn't mean that we haven't gained a lot through industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. But we've also paid a price. And the Romantics are very sensitive to the kind of price that we have paid. So you will notice then, if we can go back to the slide here, the tendency to glorify the natural world. Not the artificial world created by humans, but the natural world. It's not that people didn't love nature before the 19th century. It's that it became a kind of cult in the 19th century. You know, oh my God, let's get out into nature. That really makes sense for somebody who's shut up inside an office or a factory the rest of the time, right? Let's go to the seashore, let's go to the mountains, let's go to, you know, the woods, or, you know, camp out or go fishing, or, you know, whatever it is that you like to do out there in the outdoors. Okay? Previously, people didn't have to go to the outdoors, they lived in the outdoors. So there's a stress often on the value of rural life in traditional communities. And often this will be romanticized, as we say. a stress on the value of rural life, or at least a life lived close to nature. I mean, we're not all farmers, right? But we certainly can value nature and cherish our time in nature. There's also a stress on the innocence of childhood with a corresponding sense of loss in growing up, because growing up to a large extent can be a matter of conforming, right? Learning to conform. Learning to conform. Children are very spontaneous, aren't they? They're curious about everything. They're spontaneous. They have fun. You know, and then we come along at a certain point in their young lives and we start structuring them, not in certain necessary ways. I mean, after all, you have to have times when you're going to eat or go to sleep and so forth. I'm not talking about that. But we start structuring their lives more and more and more with all kinds of rules. For example, school, where everybody sits in a desk in a room in which all the desks are organized in rows, right, and ranks. It's a military design. It's a military design. You know, I mean, it was quite consciously set up as a military design originally. Okay, and everything is very structured. Now you study arithmetic, now you study music, now you study, you know, history or whatever it may be. Okay? And of course, a high value is placed on conformity to the rules and to the system. Okay? And the Romantics are going to say, well, of course, once again, obviously you gain in this system. But what have you lost? Maybe you've lost, I don't mean you, I mean all of us, me too, have lost some sense of our innocence and of our spontaneity in the process. There's also a valuing of subjective experience, not just objective knowledge, okay? If you're a student of the natural and social sciences, you hear a lot about objective knowledge, don't you? And the means by which you not only acquire, but also test objective knowledge. The Romantics are going to turn this around. They're not against scientific knowledge by any means. But they're going to turn this around. They're going to say, what's getting ignored in the process is the importance and the value of subjective experience. Personal, emotional, intuitive, imaginative, spiritual, subjective experience. And that too can be a guide to knowledge and some of the most important truths about ourselves and our relation to the world around us, including our relations with one another. And that's something that we are indebted to the Romantics for their emphasis on that. They're constantly suggesting to us the limits of objectivity. It's not that objectivity is bad, especially in scientific investigations, but there are limits to objectivity, especially in the ways that we are forced to distance ourselves from nature, to treat nature as an object, as a thing, to be studied unemotionally and dispassionately. We give something up in the process. We may gain a lot, but we also lose something. Because this can also carry over into our relations with our fellow creatures, or even our relations with ourselves. So the Romantics will deliberately cultivate feeling and imagination. And Romantic poetry constantly is exploring, cultivating, promoting feeling and imagination. We don't just get depictions of nature. We are invited to feel something about nature. Okay? On the seashore, in the mountains, wherever it may be. Which, of course, ultimately leads to a cultivation of sympathy, or as we nowadays say, empathy. That is to say, a kind of true fellow feeling. Kind of true fellow feeling. Am I part of nature, or is nature simply something out there? That's actually an interesting question. You know, often when we talk about nature, we're really talking about something out there, right? But what if nature is something in here, as well as out there? I mean, I'm part of nature, right? And nature is part of me. And you, and so forth. Which also means that you and I are part of one another, too. I mean, that logically follows, doesn't it? I mean, if we are all part of the same nature, not here we are over here, and nature is somewhere else, out there. But if we are all part of the same nature, then we are part of one another, too. Okay? So if that's true, then notice that's going to have a profound influence on how we behave toward one another and how we interact with one another. Right? There's an elevation of the individual and of individuality among the Romantics. And we're going to see this as more important among some of the Romantics than of others. Remember what I said about family relations. Somebody like Byron is going to stress individuality in a fairly extreme way. Whereas somebody like Coleridge is going to do so in a much less extreme way, and Keats, it's going to be difficult to see how he does this, at least how he does this very directly. And of course, there then is the paradox of the individual as distinct from others, yet ultimately connected to others. I mean, after all, you know, you and I are distinct from one another as individuals. And yet there's another sense in which we are ultimately connected. Or at least that's the view that the Romantics would be proposing in general. I mean, some of these are going to push it much harder than others. Watch when we get to Wordsworth. Wordsworth's really going to push this idea very hard. Whereas some of the other Romantics will go along with it, but they won't push it quite so hard. So there's a new conception of spirituality that develops, which is often unconventional. It's often unconventional for its time. For its time. Okay? Now, in poetry, that is going to lead to a development of the poet's own personal voice in poetry. Now let me be as clear as it is possible to be, I hope, about this. In general, and you might argue for some exceptions to this, but in general, among many earlier poets, and there are exceptions to what I'm about to say, there are poets who would deliberately try to adopt a kind of public voice or public self in their poems, not something which was distinctively personal, but even what might appear to be personal was actually something that was public and more or less conventional. Okay, this was the way a poet was supposed to speak. The whole notion of originality begins to shift at this time. You know, if you go back to the ancients, and I'm just going to take somebody like Homer as my example, but we could take lots of other writers. But let me go back to Homer. If we go back to Homer, what does originality mean? Homer didn't make up the stories that he tells. I mean, Homeric scholars have been able to dig out all kinds of already existing narratives that were available to a Homer, whoever Homer may have been. And what Homer has done is to have come along and he has brought together these different already existing poetic narratives in a tradition of poetic narrative that was passed on orally, not in written form, but orally, by poet singers for generations. Actually, it's demonstrable for hundreds of years. And so there's a sense in which Homer, while enormously important for what he did, was not doing something original in the sense of being all his own, all made up by Homer. See what I'm getting at? That he's a traditional poet who is operating in a tradition. And the role of the poet was to bring together the elements of the tradition and pass it on. And then the next poet would be benefiting from Homer and bringing together Homer and other elements of the tradition perhaps and passing that on in a long oral tradition before anything even gets written down. Okay? Now, you might say, well, that may be true of Homer, but Homer's really way back then, isn't he? Yeah, he's way back then. But something of that you can find in a Chaucer, something of that you can find in a Shakespeare, something of that you can find in a Milton, certainly something of that you can find in a Pope. That even as late as the 17th and 18th centuries, when people talked about genius, they didn't talk about genius as being something that was internal to a particular individual. What they meant by genius was more the Platonic idea that there is some kind of force, some kind of spiritual force that some people can tap into, and that is what speaks through us. That's actually, by the way, what Plato says in a dialogue of his called the Ion. You know, that's what the poet is. The poet is a kind of medium through whom some kind of spiritual force is speaking. And that's genius. See, but it's not, I'm a genius. It's that, fortunately, for reasons that I can't account for, That genius has chosen to speak through me. Okay? In the 19th century, you begin to see a shift where people begin to think in terms of some individuals having genius or being genius. Okay? That's an internalizing and a personalizing of the whole question of poetic of poetic inspiration and creation. Okay? So that notice there comes to be less emphasis eventually on technique in the traditional sense of technique and more emphasis on individual inspiration. Now that doesn't mean that modern artists aren't interested in technique. I'm not saying that. But if you know something about traditional artists, you'll know that, and I'm talking about in the sense in which I'm using that term, traditional as in part of a tradition, technique becomes something which is supremely important. Let me give you one example. In Ireland, the Fili, the poets, in a bardic tradition, were apprenticed for, according to some sources, as long as 24 years. Count them, 24 years before they could be recognized as poets of any consequence. You know, I mean, up to that point, you're an apprentice. You're still learning. Because the craft was considered to be so complex. And you look at early Irish poetry, and it's amazingly complex. I've actually translated some of this, and it's extremely complicated. And it took years and years and years and years and years for people to learn the different forms and the different rules and the different complexities and opportunities within that system of poetry. Okay? That's not the sort of thing that we tend to think of in terms of poetic inspiration and creation in our time. Now that doesn't mean that we don't want our poets to be familiar with techniques, to experiment with techniques, to try them out, to have a sense of form. Of course we do. But we tend to lay even greater emphasis upon the personal and the inspirational. And of course, there are metaphorical gender shifts. This is something that we're going to see in various cases where you may find all kinds of things happening here. A romantic poet who will be using specifically feminine kinds of metaphors for what the male poet is attempting to give birth to, let's say. So we'll be on the alert for that sort of thing when it comes up. Okay. We're going to begin with Blake next in our next class, but we're not going to be going to Blake this evening. What I'd like to do now is to go to another one of, well, let's see. I need to get back to the desktop. And I need to get to this folder. And then, let's see here. Okay. Let's tie in some of the things that I've been talking about to the social and historical context in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. And this is where I'm going to be talking about history. So, how are we doing? Is this, oh, thank you. My pal back here in the booth is pointing out to me that I needed to click on the other icon to get this to work properly. Okay, remember I was talking about population shifts and so forth from rural settings into the cities. Let's actually look at some of the facts. These are the things that influenced millions of people. And it was out of this kind of social milieu that the poets were writing, at least in part. In the mid to late 17th century, London had about 500,000 inhabitants. But by the 1801 census, London had increased to about 1.1 million persons. Now, do you know what that would have been in those days? I mean, that's absolutely incredible. How do you double in size in a relatively short period of time? And of course, the increase in population was largely among poorer people. These were not people who could afford to build new houses in the suburbs. You know, we talk about Houston. And Houston is growing very, very rapidly. It has grown very rapidly. And you know, we're going to double in size in about the next 11 to 12 years. Now, the way in which we're going to accommodate that, in large part, not totally, but in part, is going to be through new building. But that implies that there are going to be people moving into the area who are going to be economically capable of either renting those apartments or buying those houses or condos, right? But the people we're talking about, the vast majority of the people we're talking about, who were moving from the country into a city like London, they didn't have money. So larger and larger and larger numbers of people were forced into relatively fixed urban areas. Not totally fixed, but relatively fixed urban areas. And there are figures where they talk about, you know, as many as 17 people living in a one-bedroom apartment, the equivalent of a one-bedroom apartment. I mean, can you imagine the conditions, just the physical conditions? And if there were any illness, of course, the illness would spread like the proverbial wildfire, not only among a particular family, but from one family to another, to another, to another, to another. Public health became a huge problem. Public sanitation became a huge problem. And we have lots of writers talking about that sort of thing. Okay? Total population growth for England in a half century was about 25%. That's incredible, isn't it? And where are those people going to go? Not to more farms. There weren't more farms. As a matter of fact, there were fewer farms because of the enclosures and whatnot. So that's primarily going to be in urban development. Not totally, but primarily. By 1801, 30% of the mainland population lived in towns. 30%. Now that's the beginning of a trend which is still going on. You all have probably seen these things. They're reported in the newspapers every once in a while. That according to census figures in the United States, it's somewhere around 2.5% of people live in rural settings in the United States. The rest of us live in towns and cities. 2.5%. I mean, that's amazing. I'm not talking about people who take their vacations out in the country. I'm not talking about people who may be well enough off that they can have a country home. I'm talking about people who live in the country. I mean, that's a huge difference, isn't it? So whereas a century earlier, you know, somewhere around, say, 1700, the beginning of the 18th century, about half of the gross national product was from agriculture. This figure went down to about a third by 1800. And manufacturing, trade, and transport took over most of the economy. See, the reason why I'm giving you these facts is to set the stage, because there were people who within their own lifetime were seeing these changes take place. And in many cases they were horrified. They weren't all horrified, but in many cases some were horrified by what they were finding. You don't have to write all of this down, but just to know what I'm talking about here. Exports of textiles. Textiles, clothes, right? I mean, well, material anyway. Much of which would be made into clothing. Rose from 50% of total exports in 1750 to 60% by 1800, and cotton took over 39% of exports by 1810, using fibers imported from America for manufacture and trade. So notice that England is increasingly turning into a big factory. What by the middle of the 19th century, people are going to typify by the term mill town. Mill town, as in the mills. Coal output doubled between 1750 and 1800 as steam pumps developed and power requirements for engines increased. Coal output. I don't know how many of you have been to London. How many of you have been to London? Anybody? Yeah, one person in this group? Two? Okay. Well, one of the things you'll notice if you go to London, if you were old enough, I mean, I know that you guys are not old enough to remember this, but if you were old enough, is that London is actually very clean now. It's a very clean city, and you can actually see, you know, white stone in the buildings and so forth. I mean, you might not think that, but if you could go back 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, it was black, grimy, sooty. And that was from the coal. Not only manufacturing using immense amount of coal, but people in their homes and apartments using coal. And then finally, the government stepped in and said, look, we've got to do something about this, and they required a filter to be placed on any chimney, you know, that emitted the soot from coal fires, coal furnaces, coal fireplaces, and whatnot. And within a decade or so, it was amazing. The city started becoming clean again, and the air became relatively clean again. Yeah. Don't forget
yeah, I was going to say, you might want to say relatively, because my parents live there, and I go like 3 or 4 times a year, and like they have a flat there, and it's right across from the American Embassy, so it's right in the middle of downtown, and the rules are like they have to clean the buildings like every 2 years, because it gets so gross with all the pollution there, and you walk around downtown for a little while, and I mean, you really feel the pollution on you. I mean, it is cleaner, and then when you look at the historical buildings, they'll show you like the places where they've cleaned and the places where they haven't, and you see a huge difference, but it still gets gross. I mean, it's hugely polluted compared to the U.S.
Yeah. Well, then that becomes another kind of issue, you know, which we could maybe debate about. But I'm talking about this in relative terms, that you're not old enough to I don't know if your parents are or not, to remember this, but London used to be a much dirtier city than it is now. I'm not saying that everything's perfect now, but and you're no doubt right. But this also is indicative of the kind of problem that I'm talking about. You see that one of the prices we pay, or at least so far have been paying for living in cities like this, is a fair amount, in some cases an unconscionable amount of pollution. And these people already were worried about that. You know, what were we doing to ourselves? I mean, they didn't understand the medical aspects of it in the same detail that we do, but they knew that it wasn't good for you. James Watt patented his separate condenser steam engine in 1774, and this was improved in 1781. And you don't have to remember that unless you want to, but the point is that this really transformed the world. The development of the steam engine really transformed the world. I mean, if you were going to come up with what are the top 10 inventions that have really made the most difference in the development of humankind, I mean, one of them would have to be the wheel. You know, another would have to be the development of agriculture and so forth. We could go down our list, but certainly one of them would have to be the development of the steam engine, because all of a sudden the world changed with the development of the steam engine. Not only did this transform the cotton industry and other industries as well, but by 1804 steam engines were powering locomotives. The whole rail system began to develop. There was no such thing as that in England and elsewhere. How did people get around? People didn't get around. If you were very well off and you were willing to endure long-distance carriage rides, yeah, you could get from one place to another, more or less, though there were some places that were pretty much inaccessible. Most people never moved from where they were born and grew up. Part of the reason was, how would they? How would they? And then all of a sudden, the trains came along, and it became possible to go across the whole country in a day or so. You know, and people to get to places like go to the seaside. I mean, people who've never been to the seaside, excuse me, could go to the seaside. People could go to sports events. One of the biggest transformations that took place in the 19th century as a result of the development of a quick, efficient transportation system was the development of sports. So that sporting events, so that sports were no longer just local activities, but became larger sporting events where you could have large masses of people, like our crowds. Okay? I mean, obviously, if you're going to have people going to a baseball game, so let's say, you have to have the means of transportation to get thousands and thousands of people to the stadium where the baseball game's going to take place. We take that for granted. That sort of thing did not exist until relatively modern times. And so sports were local games played within small towns and villages, and sometimes they would compete against, you know, one village group would compete against the next village group, you know, that sort of thing. And then ships in 1812. I mean, can you imagine the difference that this made in sea travel? Not only in the speed and efficiency of sea travel, but also the development of commerce. And by the way, these ships in general were safer. than the old wooden ships, sailing ships, the so-called tall ships. At the same time, a guy named Henry Maudslay invented the screw-cutting lathe, a fact which you will be able to wow your friends with now, along with the micrometer, which made precisely accurate manufacture of machine parts possible. You see, until you have the technology to develop machine parts, how do you make machines? Right? How do you make an automobile engine? Well, you have to have the technology to make the machine, the parts of the machine in the first place. And you have to be able to do that precisely. Precisely. From this point on, machines could make more and ever more complex machines. In other words, machines could now make machines, which could make machines, which could make machines. And notice that the individual person in this becomes less and less important. I'm not talking about the engineer or the inventor. I'm talking about the guy who operates the machine. Now, of course, there are always going to be skilled machinists. And these are very creative and bright people. I'm talking now about the person on the assembly line, who simply, is part of a much larger mechanized system. From farm to city, as agricultural technology improved and improved production, farming required fewer workers. There was a whole revolution, which I'm not going to go into detail about here, but there was a whole revolution in agricultural technology. New kinds of plows and plowing systems and so forth. People were learning more about agriculture. There were actually people who were doing scientific studies of agriculture and improving production far beyond what it had been before. You drive out in the country, right? I mean, maybe some of you grew up in the country. Actually, I grew up in a very small town. But with farms all around you, and if you drive, even if you're from Houston or someplace like Houston, you drive out in the country and you see the farms and so forth. And you can have a quite large farm with only maybe one guy or two people doing the plowing and the furrowing and the planting and coming and doing the gathering of the crops and the processes that you go through after the gathering of the crops. A relatively small number of people can do that sort of thing, where it used to require on the same size farm dozens and dozens of people. It was very, very labor intensive. But as the technology improved, fewer workers were required, and therefore, where did these people go? Where did they go? Well, they went into the towns and cities, where they could find only limited employment, if any at all, and as I've said, lived mainly in poor housing under unhealthy conditions. And again, while the upper and middle classes generally prospered, the lower classes, by far the majority, experienced lower standards of living. I mean, think about it for a moment. If you're a small farmer living in a rural community, you may not have a lot of money, but you're going to be able to feed yourself and your family. Okay, I'm not talking about the big farmers who are rich. Some of them are rich anyway. I'm talking about the little guy. They might not have a lot, but they'd get by anyway. And they'd have decent food, and a place to live and generally healthy environments for themselves and their children. Okay? But they move into the town without any skills, urban skills, or education for that, with no kinds of training programs like we have. And it was extremely difficult for them simply to get by. And many didn't. Social problems, widespread unemployment, theft, prostitution, endemic alcoholism. There were places like in Gin Alley in London where you could go and for a penny you could take the tube. There was a big cask which was filled with gin, which was really just rot gut. And they would try to cover up how raw the alcohol was with juniper. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Maybe all of you know what I'm talking about. With the cheaper gins, that distinctive gin odor? That's juniper, from juniper berries. Well, you can dump a lot of juniper into really, really, really cheap alcohol, and you can cover up the rawness of the cheap alcohol. And so it was the cheapest form of alcohol that they could produce in the 18th century. And so people in Gin Alley used to go, and for a penny, you could get enough gin that would get you pretty well along, let's say. And so alcoholism was absolutely endemic. Among people who had nothing, their lives were going nowhere. It was awful. Cultural critiques, you find them. Hogarth, anybody know who Hogarth was? Artist of the 18th century, did engravings. Usually critical of society and satirical. He had prints depicting Gin Alley and the degradation not only of fashionable rakes, but also of the seduction of country girls into prostitution. Now, we can be as superior as we want to be, but we don't have to face those things, most of us. And, here would be young women who would go into the city, and, what if you're starving? Literally, what if you are starving? Or you have a child, and your child is starving. And you can't go to the doctor because you don't have any money. And your child is going to die. These people became vulnerable, unfortunately, to becoming prostitutes, and so prostitution became a major kind of cottage industry. And, of course, the men, in many cases, turned to lives of crime, theft, petty theft of one kind or another. And as I've mentioned, Goldsmith's The Deserted Village talks about this at some length. It's a poem. How wealthy people came in and took over the land, either bought it all up and displaced the local farmers, or by the passing of the Enclosure Acts, privatized what previously had been public common land. And of course, with the same result. The small farmers were displaced. Or Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. Probably most people have read that, or at least heard parts of that in high school, if not in a college course. It's a very, very popular and very teachable poem, in which Gray is celebrating the common life of rural people. That the great and the powerful all end up in the same graveyard as people who don't have any money, may have little in the way of education, and those people who may not have very much money may really be very good and decent human beings and of far greater quality in all important senses than the person who, quote, rose to great heights. Or Robert Burns, who wrote a whole bunch of poems celebrating Scottish folk life. Just the life of ordinary Scottish people. Again, that emphasis on the value of the rural and of traditional communities in rural settings. Okay? Celebrations of rural nature and of the natural sentiments, natural feelings. Not just the great education. I mean, there's nothing wrong with education, of course. Education is wonderful. But you don't have to have a college education to be a really decent moral person, following one's best moral sentiments. That's the kind of thing that you find in this poetry. Okay, so what we're going to be taking up then is going to be a whole group of poets in England who more or less are characterized by the kinds of features that I've been talking about for the last while. But this is also an international movement. Romanticism is developing on the continent as well as in England, though sometimes it takes different forms on the continent. Germany has a very great romantic literature, and of course, eventually, music, opera. Think of romantic opera in Germany. And of course, developing also in Italy, romantic opera. I mean, most operas, most of the classic operas, if you were to go to see them or even just to read summaries of their plots in many cases, I mean, that's pure romanticism of a certain kind, over and over and over again. Okay, in America, it's all moving over here. Now, here in the American colonies, and then in the young American Republic, we weren't facing the same kinds of problems, and certainly not at the same rate of development. Yes, there were some large cities, like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, but they were relatively small compared to the great cities of Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. And the problems that they had were not as great in scale, at any rate, as the problems in England and European countries. Not yet, at any rate. And yet by the third, fourth, fifth decades of the 19th century, you have what in America is called transcendentalism. You've heard of transcendentalism, right? And the American transcendentalists, who are some of them? Emerson, Thoreau, yeah. You know, a whole group of people, right? Not just Emerson and Thoreau, though those are the biggies that we usually run into in school. And what are the transcendentalists talking about? They're talking about the same kinds of things that the English Romantic writers are talking about. They're saying that there is some kind of reality which transcends that which we see and touch and feel and smell and hear, though our way of encountering that is to move through that which we experience with our senses, especially not in the artificial environments created by humans, but out there in nature. out there in nature. Emerson, was a Unitarian minister. And even the Unitarian Church was too hidebound for Emerson, and that's saying a lot, by the way. And so Emerson resigned his position as minister. And he said, the reason why is you're not going to find God in the church. This is Emerson, this is not me. Don't write letters to me about this, please. This is Emerson speaking. He said, you're not going to find God in the church. You know where you're going to find God? You're going to find God out there. Go out in the woods. And that's where you're going to experience God. And that's really what he was talking about. He's talking about experience. He's not saying God isn't everywhere. Now I'm looking at this from the point of view of obviously somebody who's a believer in God. Where are you going to have a religious experience? What Emerson is going to say is, you've got to get out. Get out there in the mountains. Get out there in the woods. Get out there in the seashore. Get out there on a lake someplace. That's where you will experience the divine, the transcendent, the transcendental, if you wish. Transcendental is simply a term which means beyond this level of ordinary experience. In sunsets, in mountains, in waterfalls, that's where you will experience the divine, and the divine in and through nature, of which we are, or at least ought to be a part. Okay? Not distanced from. Why do you think his protege, Henry David Thoreau, went out to live at Walden Pond? The whole experiment of going to live at Walden Pond was to see if you could live a life very simply, very naturally, with very few things. He didn't carry much stuff out with him, did he? And he just built a shanty that he bought from an Irish family, which was just nothing. It was just a little shack. There was a political statement in that, by the way. And he carries all the wood and the nails and whatnot out there to Walden Pond and builds it so he can experience life in nature. That's where one experiences the divine in nature. So.